Okay, so this is the fourth of these videos that I'm going to do. I've talked about revelation. I've talked about revelation producing hunger. And then yesterday I spoke about taking ownership of that which God has provided. And today I want to just move on to the next thing, which I've seen connected with these other three. And that is this, that is risk. Now, we see this picture, perfect picture of what it looks like to step into God's promises in the account of Peter in the boat and Jesus walking on the water. There's Jesus out on the water, walking on the water. I mean, we read that and it's kind of become, oh yeah, Jesus walked on the water. He was walking on water. Think about that. Think about how extraordinary that was. Think about what effect that must have had on the disciples. I mean, if you were walking down by the River Soar in Leicester and you looked out on the water and you saw somebody walking across the river, you'd be a bit shocked. So you can imagine these disciples looking out there at Jesus. And not only is he walking on water, he's walking on water in the midst of a storm. And Peter, they're looking at him, and Peter looks out and he says, "If that's you, Lord, tell me to come." And Jesus says, "Come." Now, there's the promise. Come. Now is the step that Peter had to get from the boat into the promise. And stepping out of that boat is always going to be involved whenever you begin to step into anything God has promised you. There's always going to be the journey from receiving the promise, believing the promise, pursuing the promise, taking ownership of the promise, and then stepping out and coming to the place of conviction that you don't just believe it's true. You're not just hungry to see it happen. You don't just believe it's definitely yours, but now you're going to actually step out of the boat of your current experience and take a risk. And that moment there from no experience to risk is a huge step. And sometimes what can happen is we judge success on whether that moment works or not. I don't believe that God looks at it that way. I believe God looks at it this way. I believe the Lord celebrates your willingness to take risk. We've been deceived into thinking that if it doesn't look the way it's supposed to, then I've failed. But I think the Lord celebrates every single time we're prepared to step out of our current experience and take risk and begin to put our foot out into territory that we've never stood on before. I believe we go through some weird transformation from when we're children. I mean, if you think about it, we've got 4 children. When our children, every single one of them, we didn't celebrate any less when each one of them began to walk. It was an amazing experience. The first one walked, it's like, yay, and then they fall over. We didn't kind of go, oh, they fell over. We celebrated the one step. And that was true for all 4 of them. And all 4 of them, there was a phone call immediately afterwards. They took a step. Were they walking? Well, technically not really. They were kind of more like falling in style. But the point was is they were beginning to recognize that that was a part of their capacity. And I want to encourage you that the time when you believe that these promises are actually really yours, the time that you believe when Jesus said, you'll do the same things I did, and even greater things. The time that that is a reality in your life is when it begins to produce risk, when it begins to produce that drive in you that you're prepared to ignore circumstances, to ignore the potential of failure, but you're now beginning to step out. I remember many years ago, on one occasion, the Lord began to speak to me about the fact that he wanted to get people out of crutches. And I was in a coffee shop and I saw a guy and I saw some crutches by his chair, so I thought, I'm going to take some risk. So I went over to him and said, hey, I see you got some crutches. I'm a minister. Would you let me pray for you? And the guy says, yeah, you can pray for me. And I went to put my hand on him. He goes, what, now? He goes, not in the shop. And it was like, oh, no, it didn't happen. Now, at that moment, I could have gone, oh, risk didn't work. And I could have gone into fear. But actually, a few weeks later, I was ministering in a church somewhere else. And while I was speaking, I saw some crutches sticking out under a chair. And in the middle of the message, I stopped and said, who do they belong to? And this guy was there and I said, what's wrong? He says, oh, I've torn some ligaments in my leg. And I said to him, so God's been talking to me about getting people up who need crutches, do you think that we could see whether the first one's going to be you? And this guy was willing, and we entered into the journey. And to cut a long story short, I prayed for him, and by the time we were finished, his crutches were on the floor and he was walking around. It began with the conviction that God wanted to do it, and then you got to take risk. So I want to encourage you, receive the promise, let it produce hunger in you, take ownership of it, and take risk. Amen, and God bless.